Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Let's set the stage. It is the year 1526.
Right.
You are standing on the dusty plains of Panipat in northern India. And for centuries, warfare in this region has followed a very specific, predictable rhythm.
You mean like massed infantry formation?
Exactly. Thousands of men massing in formation and, of course, the earth-shaking charge of war elephants. But on this specific day, a sound rips across the battlefield that has never been heard here before.
A completely new sound for the region.
Yeah, a concussive roar, a flash of fire and blinding smoke, and suddenly this invisible force is tearing through the front lines with devastating kinetic energy.
Which naturally causes the elephants to panic.
Right, they panic. The traditional defensive formations break apart entirely. In a matter of hours, a centuries-old way of war is instantly rendered obsolete by a new technology. Gunpowder. But that moment at Panipat didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of a massive tectonic shift that had been grinding away for nearly 1,000 years.
Yeah, when we look at historical maps, there is this tendency to view the expansion of empires as a sudden flood. Like a dam breaks and a single uniform wave of color just washes over a continent.
But history doesn't work like that. It operates much more like tectonic plates.
Slow changes.
Right, characterized by immense pressures, long periods of grinding friction, and then these sudden, violent ruptures that reshape the entire landscape. So today, we are undertaking a highly detailed deep dive into one of those massive tectonic shifts.
Specifically, the Muslim conquests in the Indian subcontinent.
Yeah, it's a millennium-long process that fundamentally restructured South Asia. We are looking at a temporal scope that begins in the 8th century.
With the early Umayyad incursions on the coast.
Exactly, and it extends all the way to the 18th century, witnessing the rise and eventual fragmentation of the Mughal Empire.
So we are going to trace exactly how the military tactics, the economic motivations, and the religious policies evolved over those 1,000 years.
And we should note, the information we are drawing from comes from extensive historical records. Chronicles of the era like the Chaknama, the texts of al-Balaturi, as well as modern academic analyses of the military and social shifts.
And to really understand how this worked on the ground, we can't just look at the broad strokes. We have to look at the mechanics, right? Like, how does an empire actually feed a massive slave army?
Or how a medieval spy network functions. We're going to dig into the competing sources, balancing the state propaganda of the conquering chroniclers against the raw, localized economic data of the people actually living through it.
Impartially examining the texts without taking ideological sides.
Right. So to start, we have to move away from the broad geopolitical map of the Umayyad Caliphate,
which by the early 8th century stretched from Spain all the way to Central Asia.
Yeah, it was massive. But we need to zoom in on a highly localized incident on the coast of Sindh in present-day Pakistan. This brings us to the year 707.
707.
The catalyst for what would become a millennium of historical change actually begins with a maritime dispute.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Specifically, pirates operating out of the port of Babur, which was under the nominal control of Raja Dahir.
The Brahmin ruler of Sindh?
Right.
Let me stop you there, because the leap from coastal pirates to continental conquest seems massive. How does a localized dispute over a ship trigger a military response from an empire based thousands of miles away in the Middle East?
It comes down to economics.
Yeah.
And internal security. There was a brisk, highly profitable maritime trade network operating between the Arabian Peninsula, the western coast of India, and Sri Lanka.
Following the monsoon winds.
Exactly. Ships would ride the eastern monsoons to collect spices and return on the western monsoons. In 707, a Muslim merchant ship traveling from Sri Lanka to Arabia was attacked by these pirates near Dabal.
So they capture the ship.
They capture it, taking the men, women, and children on board as prisoners. The Umayyad governor of Iraq at the time, Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, writes to Raja Dahir. He demands the release of the captives and the punishment of the pirates.
And Raja Dahir's response?
He responds by saying he has no control over these pirates and cannot help.
Okay, so Al-Hajjaj uses this refusal as a justification for war. But, I mean, was this really just about rescuing a single ship's passengers, or was that a convenient pretext?
It was absolutely a pretext. While the pirate raid provided the immediate legal and moral justification.
Because protecting citizens is a primary duty of the state.
Right. But the Umayyads had much larger strategic objectives. They wanted to secure those highly lucrative trade routes to India and China.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, the Umayyad state was dealing with internal rebellions. Dissident groups from the caliphate were finding refuge across the border in the Sindh region. Al-Hajjaj recognized that a limited punitive strike would not be sufficient.
It's like a modern-day border skirmish that a nation utilizes as a pretext to launch a massive, long-planned geopolitical offensive.
That's a very accurate way to look at it. He needed to establish a permanent foothold. So, after an initial expedition failed, he assembled a substantial, well-equipped force.
And he placed it under the command of his nephew, Muhammad bin Qasim.
Yes, who was only 17 years old at the time.
17 years old, leading a major invasion force in 711. The logistics of this campaign are what really stand out to me. Qasim departs from Shiraz in late 710.
With a very specific force.
Yeah, he has 6,000 Syrian cavalry and 6,000 camel infantry. Moving 12,000 men and their animals across the harsh terrain of the Makran Desert it's a monumental task.
They're digging wells, establishing fortified supply camps, just to keep the army alive before they even see combat.
But the most critical component of his military hardware doesn't come by land.
No, it arrives by sea, the heavy assault engines, specifically 5 Menjaniques.
These are the catapults, right? But the sources highlight that they were wheeled and used counterweights. Why is that specific detail so crucial?
The utility of these siege engines was twofold. Think of a massive seesaw. Before the counterweight, you had teams of men pulling ropes to fling a projectile.
Which requires a lot of coordinated manpower.
Right, but if you drop a massive fixed weight on one side of that seesaw, the other side whips a 200-pound boulder across 3 football fields with immense, repeatable force.
And what about the wheels?
Well, a stationary catapult of that size generates so much kinetic recoil when it fires that it essentially destroys its own wooden frame and foundation.
Ah, so it tears itself apart over time.
Exactly. Putting them on wheels meant the machine could roll back slightly when fired, dissipating the recoil.
So Qasim's engineers could pound the walls of Dabal continuously, day after day.
Without the machines breaking down. The Raja of Dabal closes the city gates, probably anticipating a standard siege where the attackers might eventually starve or give up.
But medieval Indian defensive walls were not built to withstand the continuous kinetic pounding of wheeled manjaniques.
No, they weren't. After a month-long blockade and bombardment, the walls of Dabal were breached in 711. The city fell, the resisting forces were executed, and the captives from the pirate raid were freed.
And Qasim ordered the construction of a mosque on the site of a demolished temple, physically marking the arrival of Umayyad authority.
From Dabal, Qasim advances inland. He secures Saiwan, and then we reach the climactic Battle of Aurora in 712.
This is where he faces Raja Dahir directly.
And here we see a clash of 2 very different military philosophies.
Right, because Dahir's forces were heavily reliant on war elephants and static defensive formations.
While Qasim's forces utilized highly mobile cavalry and superior archery.
But reading the accounts, it seems Qasim's real advantage wasn't just military hardware, it was social engineering. He recognized that Dahir's kingdom was internally fractured.
Precisely. Dahir's Brahmin dynasty ruled over a diverse population of Hindus, Buddhists, Jats, and Meds. The Jat and Med tribes in particular were heavily taxed and socially marginalized.
So they were alienated by Dahir's administration.
Yes, and Qasim actively sought out these discontented groups. He forged strategic alliances, promising them better status and tax relief.
Effectively turning Dahir's own subjects against him before the battle even began.
Dahir is killed at Aurora, his forces are routed, and Qasim proceeds to lay siege to Brahmanabad and the wealthy temple city of Multan in 713.
He captures these cities, funding further operations through the seized temple treasures. But this is the point where the narrative gets complicated.
How so?
Well, during the active sieges, temples are destroyed and wealth is stripped. That looks like pure conquest. But once the cities submit, the policy flips. Because how do you govern a vast non-Muslim populace from thousands of miles away in Damascus?
Right, you clearly don't have the manpower to keep a sword in everyone's throat forever.
You don't.
And that is where the pragmatic reality of empire building sets in. The sources, particularly the Chaknama, detail a highly calculated administrative shift.
What did that look like on the ground?
Qasim implemented the jizya, which is a poll tax levied on non-Muslims, and the kharaj, a land tax based on agricultural yield.
And in exchange for paying these taxes,
The Hindu and Buddhist populations were formally granted dhimmi status.
which means protected citizens.
Correct. This status granted them religious autonomy. They were allowed to maintain their shrines, their temples, and their daily rituals.
Qasim is actually recorded as issuing a formal proclamation about this, isn't he?
Yes, stating that the temples of the Hindus and Buddhists shall be inviolate, just like the churches of the Christians and the synagogues of the Jews.
Furthermore, local officials, village headmen, and Brahmin administrators were integrated straight into the Umayyad revenue system.
Because the Umayyads needed the taxes, and the local elites already knew how to collect them.
We really have to balance these two realities for you, the listener. If you read certain chronicles, you see the destruction of temples during active sieges.
Which was used as a symbol of military dominance and a way to pay the troops.
Right. But if you look at the day-to-day administrative data once the dust settled, that destruction ceased. Religious autonomy was protected because a functioning tax base was far more valuable to the caliphate than a devastated landscape.
It was a calculated equilibrium. It brought stability to the region and established Sindh as a lucrative frontier province.
But this eastward expansion was abruptly halted by internal politics back home.
In 715, Caliph al-Walid died in Damascus. His successor, Caliph Suleiman, holds a deep personal grudge against al-Hajjaj, the governor who initiated the campaign.
Because al-Hajjaj had already died, Suleiman turns his vengeance upon al-Hajjaj's relatives,
Which includes the young general Muhammad bin Qasim.
Qasim is recalled to Iraq, imprisoned, tortured, and executed at the age of 20.
It is a brutal end, and it completely stalls the Umayyad momentum. For the next 3 centuries, the borders essentially freeze.
Arab forces retain control of Sindh, but there is no further push into the subcontinent, which means we need to jump forward in time and shift our map.
We are moving from the 8th century to the 11th century.
And the geopolitical center of gravity moves from Damascus up into the harsh freezing steppes of Central Asia, and the entire motivation for military incursions changes.
Right. To understand this new wave, you have to understand the environment. Central Asia during this period was dominated by Turkish warriors
They were engaged in constant, grueling warfare.
against non-Muslim nomadic tribes in a landscape where resources were incredibly scarce. It was out of this brutal crucible that the Ghazi spirit emerged.
A Ghazi being a frontier warrior.
Yes, but as these Turkish groups embraced Islam, the term took on an ideological weight. It blended the concept of holy war against non-believers with the highly practical, vital reality of economic plunder.
Because these warriors survived by raiding.
Capturing slaves for the markets in Herat and Samarkand, and seizing wealth to fund their local tribal wars.
So when the Ghaznavid dynasty established its power base in Ghazni, in modern-day Afghanistan, they turned this Ghazi spirit toward the incredibly wealthy, largely untouched Indian subcontinent.
The primary figure here is Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni. Between 1001 and 1026, he launches 17 major military expeditions into India.
But unlike Qasim, Mahmud makes almost no attempt to set up a new administration in the Gangetic Plain. I look at this and I struggle to find the right framework. It looks less like an empire expanding and more like, well, aggressive corporate asset stripping.
Asset stripping.
Yeah. You know, when a private equity firm buys a company, they don't care about the long-term health of the business. They just want to liquidate the physical assets, empty the pension fund, take the cash to fund their other ventures, and leave the shell of the company to collapse.
That makes sense.
Mahmud is doing the medieval equivalent of that. He isn't trying to rule India. He's just using it as an ATM to fund his actual empire back in Central Asia.
That is an incredibly accurate way to frame the economic reality of the Ghaznavid campaigns. The Hindu temples of northern India, supported by centuries of royal patronage, land grants, and merchant donations, functioned as massive repositories of wealth.
They were literally the regional banks of their era.
Exactly. By targeting these specific temple cities, Mahmud could extract immense liquid wealth, gold, silver, jewels, and transport it back to Ghazni.
Let's look at the military mechanics that made this extraction possible. In 1001, Mahmud faces Raja Jayapala of the Hindu Shahi dynasty at the Battle of Peshawar.
Jayapala brings a massive traditional Indian army, 30,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 300 war elephants.
Mahmud brings a smaller force of 15,000 Central Asian cavalry.
The Indian forces relied heavily on the shock value, the physical mass, and the terror induced by war elephants.
The Mahmud's forces, bred in the steppes, possessed superior horse breeds and utilized swift, highly mobile tactics. More importantly, they understood the vulnerability of the elephant.
Yes, the sources mention a very specific, deliberate tactic. The Ghaznavid archers didn't just fire volleys into the mass of troops. They specifically aimed for the mahouts.
The drivers sitting atop the elephants' necks.
If you kill the driver, the tank goes rogue. By neutralizing the mahouts, the Ghaznavids induced absolute panic among the beasts.
Because an uncontrolled, terrified war elephant enduring arrow fire with no one to guide it is just as likely to turn around and trample its own infantry as it is the enemy.
This tactical disruption completely broke the Shahi lines. Jayapala was captured and forced to pay a massive ransom of 50 elephants and 200,000 dirhams.
The humiliation was so profound that Jayapala actually immolated himself shortly after his release.
Following Peshawar, Mahmud's raids become a systemic, almost industrialized process of wealth extraction.
He hits Nagarkot in 1008, Thanisar in 1014, Mathura in 1019, and most famously Somnath in 1026.
The logistics of the Somnath raid alone are staggering. He marches an army of approximately 30,000 men across the harsh Thar Desert, specifically to target this wealthy coastal temple in Gujarat.
The haul from Somnath was massive. Chroniclers estimated at 20 million dirhams.
The primary idol, along with countless others made of solid gold and silver, were broken apart, loaded onto pack animals, and melted down to be minted into coinage back in Ghazni.
And here is where we have to critically examine the sources. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers, like Al-Utbi, wrote about these campaigns in glowing, ecstatic terms.
They framed the destruction of idols and the plundering of temples as immense ideological and religious triumphs.
Casting Mahmud as the ultimate champion of the faith.
The rhetoric of the Ghazi was heavily utilized as state propaganda. It served a very practical purpose. It legitimized the raids and attracted thousands of volunteers from across Central Asia who flocked to Mahmud's banner, seeking both spiritual reward and a share of the immense spoils.
But if you strip away the religious rhetoric and look at the physical evidence, the underlying reality was purely economic.
The melted gold, the looted jewels, and the hundreds of thousands of enslaved people taken back to Central Asian markets formed the economic engine that built the Ghaznavid Empire's palaces, libraries, and military infrastructure.
And the cost to northern India was horrific. The sources describe immense demographic tolls. You are losing tens of thousands of people to slavery or death during each major raid.
If you look at the localized agrarian data, the economy of the Punjab region was severely disrupted.
You can't maintain complex irrigation or agricultural cycles when the labor force is constantly being carried off and the trade routes are destabilized.
Yet, despite this sheer destructive power, the Ghaznavids never established permanent control beyond the Punjab region. They left the rest of northern India fractured.
But that model of purely extractive raiding has a shelf life.
It does. By the late 12th century, the geopolitical dynamics in Central Asia shift again. The Ghaznavid Empire declines, and a new power arises from the mountainous region of Ghor in central Afghanistan.
The Ghurids.
And the Ghurids recognize the fatal flaw in Mahmud's strategy.
Right. Eventually, if you keep raiding the bank, the vault is going to be empty. If you want sustainable wealth and power, you can't just be a raider. You have to transition to permanent territorial control. You have to own the bank.
The architect of this massive strategic shift is Muiz al-Din Muhammad, commonly known as Muhammad of Ghor. He systematically begins securing the frontier.
Capturing Multan in 1175 and overthrowing the last remnants of Ghaznavid control in Lahore by 1186.
With his base secure, he turns his sights on the wealthy Gangetic plain. But standing in his way is a powerful confederacy of Rajput kingdoms led by Prithviraj Chauhan.
This clash culminates in the battles of Tarain.
The First Battle of Tarain takes place in 1191.
Muhammad of Ghor marches in, likely expecting his disciplined Central Asian cavalry to carve through the Indian forces, just as Mahmud had done a century earlier. But the Rajputs are ready.
They deploy their traditional heavy cavalry and massed elephants, but they execute a devastating, highly coordinated frontal charge that shatters the Ghurid lines.
Muhammad of Ghor is severely wounded in combat. He is bleeding, his army is collapsing around him, and he only barely escapes the battlefield, carried to safety by a loyal Khalji horseman.
The Ghurid army is completely routed. It is a decisive, crushing Rajput victory.
I always try to put myself in the shoes of a commander after a defeat like that. He retreats all the way back to Ghazni. How do you restructure?
It requires a fundamental shift in thinking.
In modern terms, it is like a sports team going to the championship, running their standard reliable playbook and getting absolutely demolished because the opponent countered it perfectly.
You have to completely abandon your traditional strategies.
And find a systemic weakness in the opponent's defense to exploit.
The preparation for the Second Battle of Tarain in 1192 is a historical masterclass in tactical adaptation. Muhammad of Ghor spends a year rebuilding his forces, returning with an army of 120,000 disciplined Turkic cavalrymen.
But crucially, he completely changes his battlefield doctrine. He knows a traditional frontal clash against Rajput heavy cavalry is suicide.
So he divides his cavalry into 4 distinct units. He deploys highly mobile mounted archers to continuously harass the Rajput front lines, keeping his main forces out of reach.
The Rajputs rely on their heavy cavalry to close the distance and force a brutal, decisive melee.
But the Ghurid archers refuse to engage in close combat. They utilize the classic step tactic, the feigned retreat.
They ride up, fire a volley of arrows, and then immediately pull back, pretending to flee.
It is incredibly frustrating for the defending force. The Rajputs are drawn out of their solid defensive formations to chase the seemingly fleeing archers.
Once the Rajputs break formation and string themselves out, the Ghurid archers wheel around on their horses and fire again.
This constant harassment, the false retreating, and the barrage of arrows exhausts the Rajput forces and entirely breaks their cohesion.
Once that Rajput center is drawn out, disorganized, and exhausted, Muhammad of Ghor unleashes his fresh reserve force of heavy lancers in a devastating, concentrated charge.
The Rajput lines collapse entirely. Prithviraj Chauhan is captured and subsequently executed.
The victory at the Second Battle of Talikota in 1192 is the critical turning point. The door to the Gangetic Plain is kicked wide open.
But Muhammad of Ghor cannot stay in India to rule it himself. The politics of Central Asia require his presence back home.
Because he has to delegate.
He entrusts the governance, the pacification, and the further expansion of these massive new Indian territories to his trusted Turkic slave generals, his Mamluks.
Let's pause on the word slave because it carries a very specific, brutal connotation for modern listeners. But the Mamluk system in the Turco-Persian military context is entirely different, isn't it?
Vastly different. This was not menial or agricultural chattel slavery. These were elite military slaves. They were typically purchased young from the steppes, converted to Islam, and then rigorously educated in warfare, administration, and statecraft.
Because they were severed from their original families and possessed no local tribal ties in the lands they conquered, their entire social status, wealth, and survival depended exclusively on their loyalty to their master.
Exactly. They were highly capable, fiercely loyal instruments of state power. 2 of these Mamluks stand out.
Qutb al-Din Aybak captures Delhi and secures the core territories.
And then you have Bakhtiar Khalji, who pushes rapidly eastward with a relatively small cavalry force, conquering Bihar and Bengal.
And it is during Khalji's eastern campaign around the year 1200 that we see the destruction of the great Buddhist University of Nalanda.
A massive repository of ancient knowledge, which significantly accelerated the decline of Buddhism in eastern India.
By relying on these highly trained Mamluk generals, Muhammad of Ghor established a permanent administrative footprint.
He wasn't just extracting wealth. His generals were establishing garrisons, securing the trade routes, and setting up the complex infrastructure required for sustained, long-term rule.
And that transition from conquest to administration brings us to the 13th century.
In 1206, Muhammad of Ghor is assassinated. His empire inevitably fractures.
Qutb al-Din Aybak, his viceroy in Delhi, realizes he doesn't need to take orders from whoever replaces Ghori back in Afghanistan.
He declares independence and establishes the Mamluk dynasty, the first dynasty, the Delhi Sultanate.
Now the challenge changes entirely. We are moving from the relatively simple act of conquering a territory to the complex, grinding, day-to-day reality of managing a vast subcontinent with a deeply entrenched, culturally distinct population.
The foundational structure Aybak and his successors used to manage this massive territory is the ecosystem.
I really want to dig into the ecosystem because it seems like the engine that runs the entire sultanate.
Yeah.
How did it actually function on the ground?
Simply put, an eco was a revenue-yielding land assignment. In a medieval economy, you don't always have enough minted silver or gold to pay a massive standing army.
So the Sultan grants a military officer or a noble, known as an Iqtidar or Mutai, the right to collect the agricultural taxes from a specific territory?
The officer is responsible for administration and tax collection.
Mm-hmm.
He keeps a portion of that revenue to maintain himself and, crucially, to fund a specified number of fully equipped cavalry troops for the Sultan's army.
Any surplus revenue is supposed to be remitted to the central treasury in Delhi.
That was the theory, yes.
Okay, I see the logic. It's a way to maintain military readiness without draining the central treasury. But I have to question the long-term stability of a regime built on this, if I can try an analogy here.
Go ahead.
It sounds like a corporation paying its regional franchise managers strictly through the local profits they can generate, rather than a centralized salary.
Yes, and what behavior does that incentivize?
It massively incentivizes short-term extraction. If I'm the manager and I know the Sultan might transfer me to a different region next year, I don't care about the long-term health of the local farms.
Right.
I want to squeeze as much profit out of the local peasantry as quickly as possible, overtax the resources, and build up my own personal wealth and private army.
The historical record validates your analogy perfectly. The Ike system fueled rapid military expansion because generals were highly motivated to conquer new lands to secure fresh, wealthy Ikes.
But internally, it led to severe, systemic agrarian exploitation.
The Muslim grantees were frequently absentee landlords living in the cities. They enforced incredibly high tax demands on the Hindu cultivators.
This eroded traditional crop rotations, impoverished the peasantry, and pushed the rural economy to the breaking point.
Often sparking fierce agrarian revolts. It was a system that fundamentally prioritized short-term military readiness over long-term local stewardship.
Despite these internal structural tensions, the Sultanate manages to consolidate its power.
Aybak's successor, Iltutmish, subdues internal rebellions and officially secures the borders. But the military zenith of the Sultanate arrives in the late 13th and early 14th centuries with the Khalji dynasty.
Specifically under Al-Din Khalji. And Alauddin is dealing with a threat that makes the Rajputs look manageable.
Massive Mongol invasions pouring in from the northwest.
Alauddin Khalji was a ruthless, brilliant military innovator. To counter the Mongols, who were masters of mobility, and to expand his own territory south into Gujarat and the Deccan Plateau, Khalji had to adapt.
He heavily utilized guerrilla warfare, relying on highly mobile light cavalry to launch surprise attacks, cut off Mongol supply lines, and avoid pitched battles where the Mongols excelled.
But the detail that really caught my eye in the sources was his use of intelligence. We don't often think of medieval states having sophisticated intelligence agencies.
Information is a weapon, and Alauddin understood that better than anyone. He established a vast, highly organized espionage network.
He deployed spies, scouts, and informants across the empire and into enemy territory.
They gathered detailed intelligence on troop movements, supply depots, and political vulnerabilities.
He even implemented strict price controls in the markets of Delhi, enforced by these spies.
To ensure inflation didn't devalue the currency, allowing him to maintain a massive standing army on lower salaries. Furthermore, he incorporated advanced siege technologies, utilizing heavy trebuchets to breach the formidable stone fortifications in the Deccan.
Khalji pushes the Sultanate's borders to their maximum extent. But as we move deeper into the 14th century, the administrative style shifts again under the Tughlaq dynasty.
Particularly during the reign of Firuz Shah Tughlaq.
Firuz Shah is a complex contradiction. On one hand, he is an incredible builder, focused on public works. On the other hand, he is a rigid enforcer of religious orthodoxy.
Let's examine the infrastructure first, because the scale is immense. Firuz Shah constructed entire new cities, such as Hisar and Fatabad, to solidify the state's presence in strategic regions.
But his most significant legacy was his massive irrigation projects.
He commissioned a canal system extending 150 miles from the Yamuna River all the way to Hisar. This engineering feat transformed hundreds of square miles of arid scrubland into highly productive agricultural estates.
But there is a dark side to these estates. The sources indicate they were primarily managed as state farms, and they were worked by a colossal force of slaves. We are talking about an estimated 180,000 slaves.
How does a medieval state even manage a captive population of that size?
It required a massive bureaucratic apparatus. These individuals were captured during military campaigns or taken as tribute. Feeding, clothing, and housing 180,000 people is a monumental logistical challenge.
Firuz Shah distributed them across the empire. Tens of thousands were sent to the new agricultural estates. Others were trained as artisans and placed in the royal karkhanas.
The state-sponsored workshops producing textiles, weapons, and luxury goods.
And a significant portion was armed and integrated into his personal guard, which, as we discussed with the Mamluks, creates a dangerous dependency on military slaves that often leads to instability.
The other side of his reign is his deep commitment to orthodox Islamic governance. Firuz Shah explicitly stated in his memoirs, the Futuhat-i Firuz Shahi, that his goal was to enforce Sharia law.
And he put that into practice by reimposing the jizya tax, and significantly, he extended it to include Brahmins, the Hindu priestly class, who had traditionally been exempt under earlier sultans.
He also engaged in highly publicized, targeted iconoclasm. During his military campaigns in Bengal and Odisha in the 1350s and 60s, he boasted in his writings of destroying over 1,000 idols and razing Hindu and Jain temples,
Often building mosques directly on top of those exact sites.
This architectural overlay is a recurring theme of the Sultanate period. We see it right from the beginning with Qutb al-Din Aibak's construction of the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque in Delhi.
The name translates to the might of Islam.
And if you look at the inscriptions on the mosque itself, they explicitly state that the complex was constructed using the spolia
The dismantled carved columns, the stonework, the masonry.
of 27 demolished Hindu and Jain temples.
It is an undeniable visual assertion of the new ruling class. You take the sacred, monumental architecture of the conquered population, you literally dismantle their worldview, and you build the foundation of your own religious and political center upon it.
It is a daily, physical reminder of who holds power. But power is rarely absolute, and the indigenous populations adapt.
The historical record shows that in response to this targeted iconoclasm, local communities didn't just submit, they began constructing subterranean temples.
Elaborate underground chambers designed to be completely invisible to patrolling tax collectors or military forces.
It allowed them to preserve their ritual continuity and protect their deities away from the eyes of the state. It is a testament to the resilience of the local culture.
And if we pull back and look at the broader societal and economic impacts of the Delhi Sultanate over these 3 centuries, the changes are profound.
Despite the violence, the heavy taxation, and the religious friction, the period saw a massive surge in urbanization.
The subcontinent was irrevocably integrated into a vast, common commercial and legal system that stretched from Morocco in the west all the way to Indonesia in the east. It completely ended India's geographic isolation.
You have this massive influx of new technologies flowing down those trade routes. We mentioned the karkhanas, the state factories.
You see the introduction of papermaking, which revolutionizes record-keeping and literature. You see advanced bookbinding.
The introduction of the Persian wheel, which radically improves deep well irrigation.
The textile industry, brassware, and carpet weaving flourish, creating wealthy new urban centers of specialized production.
But this era of relative integration and the Delhi Sultanate itself comes to a catastrophic, bloody end at the close of the 14th century.
In 1398, the Turco-Mongol warlord Timur, often known in the West as Tamerlane, invades India.
He isn't there to rule. He brings an army down from Central Asia and sacks Delhi with unimaginable brutality.
The city is laid waste, the population is massacred, the treasury is emptied, and Timur returns north with the spoils.
The Sultanate is gutted, central authority evaporates, and northern India fractures into numerous independent, warring regional sultanates.
Which brings us back to where we started. Following Timur's devastation, northern India remains politically fragmented for over a century.
Until the arrival of Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur, a direct descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan in the early 16th century.
Babur is pushed out of his ancestral lands in Central Asia, and he sets his sights on the fractured wealth of India.
In 1526, he faces Ibrahim Lodi, the last ruler of the weakened Delhi Sultanate, at the First Battle of Panipat.
The forces arrayed at Panipat represent a stark, unbridgeable technological asymmetry. Ibrahim Lodi fields a massive traditional army, between 30,000 and 100,000 men, alongside 1,000 war elephants.
Babur has a much smaller force, roughly 12 to 15,000 men. But Babur brings something the subcontinent had never faced in a pitched battle of this scale.
Field artillery and early gunpowder matchlocks.
We talked about this at the beginning. I'm trying to find an analogy for how a single technology renders a centuries-old tactical doctrine useless overnight.
It reminds me of the introduction of the forward pass in American football.
A forward pass?
Yeah, before the forward pass, defenses were entirely built around stopping a grinding physical running game. You packed the line of scrimmage. The moment you introduce a quarterback who can throw the ball 40 yards over the defensive line, every single old defensive formation is rendered completely useless.
You have to invent an entirely new way of playing the game.
That is exactly the dynamic, but imagine if the quarterback also had a cannon. Babur's tactics rendered the traditional elephant-led charge obsolete.
He utilized a tactic he had learned from fighting the Ottomans, known as the Araba. He chained 700 heavy supply carts together in the center of his lines.
Behind this barricade of carts, he positioned his matchlock infantry and his primitive cannons.
This protected his vulnerable gunners from cavalry charges and gave them clear, stable firing lines.
He also used the tuluma, dividing his cavalry into highly mobile right, left, forward, and rear divisions designed to sweep around and flank the enemy.
When Lodi's massive forces advanced, expecting a traditional melee, Babur's artillery opened fire.
The sheer concussive noise, the blinding smoke, and the kinetic impact of the cannons absolutely terrified the thousand war elephants.
The beasts panicked, turned around, and trampled right through Lodi's own densely packed infantry formations.
While Lodi's center was descending into bloody chaos, Babur's mobile cavalry executed the tuluma,
sweeping around and enveloping the Lodi army from the sides and rear. Ibrahim Lodi was killed, his massive army was annihilated by a force a fraction of its size, and the Mughal Empire was born through the deployment of gunpowder.
Babur establishes the empire, but he dies just a few years later. It is his grandson, Akbar the Great, ruling from 1556 to 1605, who truly consolidates the Mughal state into a superpower.
Akbar is brilliant because he realizes that a minority Central Asian elite cannot rule a massive, incredibly diverse subcontinent through military force alone.
You can conquer with gunpowder, but you can't govern with it.
He shifts the empire's doctrine from mere conquest to deep political, administrative, and cultural integration.
Akbar's most significant administrative reform was the mansabdari system. It was a decimal-based ranking system that organized the entire nobility, the military hierarchy, and the civil administration into one unified structure.
Every noble was assigned a zat rank, which determined their personal status, hierarchy, and cash salary, and a sawar rank, which dictated the specific number of armed cavalry they were required to maintain and provide for the emperor's army.
So if you were a high-ranking mansabdar with a rank of 5,000 sawar, you were legally obligated to provide 5,000 fully equipped, trained horsemen to the imperial army whenever the emperor called upon you.
Exactly. And in return, to fund these massive contingents, the mansabdars were granted jagirs,
revenue assignments that function very similarly to the older ikas we discussed during the Sultanate period.
But what made Akbar's system truly revolutionary wasn't the mechanics. It was who he included in it.
He actively integrated the Hindu Rajput warrior class into the highest echelons of the Mughal military and administrative machinery.
He formed strategic permanent alliances through marriages to Rajput princesses, most notably Harkabai, the daughter of the Raja of Amber.
He didn't just conquer the Rajputs, he made them stakeholders in the empire.
This integration was underpinned by Akbar's sweeping religious policy of Sulikul, which translates to universal peace or absolute tolerance.
In 1564, Akbar made the highly pragmatic and symbolically vital decision to abolish the jizya,
the poll tax on non-Muslims that had been a point of friction since the days of Muhammad bin Qasim in the 8th century.
Abolishing the jizya fundamentally altered the social contract between the Islamic State and its Hindu subjects. They were no longer legally subordinated by taxation based purely on their faith.
I imagine this fostered immense loyalty among the Rajput nobles. They became the vanguard of the Mughal army, fighting Akbar's wars and helping him expand the empire's borders from Gujarat in the west all the way to Bengal in the east.
Akbar realizes that tolerance isn't just a moral stance, it is a highly efficient military and administrative strategy.
By removing the religious friction, he created a unified, incredibly efficient military administrative machine that generated immense wealth.
However, historical equilibriums are rarely permanent. If we look ahead to Akbar's great-grandson, Emperor Aurangzeb, who ruled in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, we see a stark, devastating reversal of these policies.
Aurangzeb is a fascinating, deeply polarizing figure in South Asian history. He completely abandons Akbar's policy of Sulikul.
He is a strict Puritan who advocates for a much more orthodox, uncompromising interpretation of Islam.
He oversees the compilation of the Fatwa al-Amgir, attempting to establish strict Islamic Sharia law as the singular legal code across the diverse empire.
And crucially, in 1679, he reimposes the jizya tax.
The reimposition of the jizya was catastrophic for imperial unity. The tax was collected in a manner specifically designed to publicly reinforce dhimmi subordination.
It provoked immediate, violent, and sustained rebellions among the Jaths, the Satnamis, the Sikhs, and crucially, the very Rajputs who had been the loyal backbone of the Mughal military machine for a century.
In his pursuit of religious orthodoxy, Aurangzeb alienated his most vital military allies.
And he coupled this ideological rigidity with relentless, exhausting military expansionism. He was obsessed with conquering the Deccan Plateau in southern India, leading campaigns that dragged on for decades.
The Deccan campaigns were a strategic and humanitarian disaster. Aurangzeb moved his entire royal court to a massive military camp in the south, engaging in endless, grinding wars of attrition against the Marathas and the remaining Deccani sultanates.
It completely drained the immense imperial treasury Akbar and his successors had built.
The human cost was staggering. Historical estimates suggest that over the course of these wars, upwards of 4.6 million people died, not just from combat, but from the subsequent famines, logistical collapses, and plagues that ravaged the war-torn landscape of the Deccan.
The strain of these endless wars leads directly to the systemic fragmentation of the empire. We see the emergence of what historians call the Jagirdari crisis. Walk us through how that economic crisis actually breaks the empire apart.
To fight his endless wars in the south, Aurangzeb was constantly recruiting new nobles, expanding the administration, and granting them high mansab ranks to secure their loyalty.
But the empire had reached its geographic limits. They had run out of productive, revenue-yielding land to grant as jagirs.
You suddenly had a massively expanded nobility, holding ranks that entitled them to revenues that simply did not exist.
You have a polluted management structure with zero cash flow to pay them. That is a recipe for collapse.
Precisely. Because these nobles were underpaid or held worthless jagirs, they began violently rack-renting the peasantry to extract whatever wealth they could.
This led to massive agrarian revolts, further destroying the tax base.
When Aurangzeb finally died in 1707, the central authority essentially collapsed under its own weight. The later Mughal emperors who followed him became mere figureheads, confined to the Red Fort in Delhi.
They were manipulated by powerful noble factions like the Sayyid brothers, who became known as kingmakers, violently installing and deposing puppet emperors at will.
And while Delhi descends into factional bloodshed, the provincial governors out in the wealthy regions, places like Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad, simply look at the chaos, stop sending their tax revenue to the capital, and establish their own semi-independent regional states.
The Mughal Empire hollows out from the inside, leaving a politically fractured, economically exhausted subcontinent.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this incredible millennium-long process. The Muslim conquests in the Indian subcontinent were not a single monolithic event. It wasn't a sudden wave. It was a complex, continuous, agonizing evolution.
It started with those Umayyad maritime responses to piracy in the 8th century, establishing a tentative frontier foothold in Sindh.
It morphed into the brutal Ghaznavid economic raids of the 11th century, stripping the wealth of northern India's temples to fund Central Asian empires.
It evolved again with the Ghurid military innovations, the mounted archers and famed retreats, and the vital shift to permanent territorial control through highly trained Mamluk generals.
And it culminated in the deep administrative, technological, and cultural shifts of the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire.
We saw the rise of the ETA system, the brutal efficiency of Alauddin Khalji's espionage network, the introduction of papermaking, and the Persian wheel.
We saw Babur's revolutionary gunpowder artillery shatter the old world of Panipat, and we saw Akbar's brilliant, integrative Mansabdari system build an empire, only for Aurangzeb's rigid orthodoxy and endless wars to tear it back down.
All of which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. Consider how this continuous millennium-long influx of Central Asian and Middle Eastern military technology, these advanced administrative frameworks, and these vast interconnected trade networks fundamentally ended the Indian subcontinent's relative geographic isolation.
How did this millennium of intense, often violent, and deeply transformative integration into the broader Islamic world unwittingly lay the structural, logistical, and economic groundwork that the later European maritime empires would exploit?
The complex systems of land revenue extraction, the deeply centralized trade routes stretching to the coasts, the massive urban manufacturing centers producing textiles and goods, these were the very mechanisms that European powers, beginning with the East India Company, would eventually co-opt, manipulate, and adapt for their own colonial enterprises.
The tectonic plates had shifted over 1,000 years, creating a landscape perfectly primed for the next massive rupture.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.